Hello everyone, it's time for Sunday School. Today I'm in the Sunday School classroom of our preschoolers. It's a bright room, as you can tell. It's kind of neat. We've got a window that you can look through one way so that the kids don't see parents checking on them. Miss Susan teaches this class, does a great job, and every time I come by, the kids are around this little table and having a great time. So if you're a family at home that has young people, bring them here. It would be a good class for them. Today's lesson is for May the 24th. We only have one lesson left after this one in the book of Romans. And since we're at the end of the quarter, you need to make sure that you get your new quarterly for the next lesson, the next series of lessons. Today's lesson is entitled Accepting. Believers should accept and encourage other believers to facilitate unity. We're looking at various types of unity in the church today. The human body is composed of many systems. We have a digestive system, we have an endocrine system, a skeletal system, and so on. All of the systems have to mesh together to work well. When one system is broken or out of sorts, it affects the whole body. And the church is just like that. We are a system or a group of systems that work together, and we need to work together in order to be healthy and whole. We won't be alike, but we need to work together. Our text for today is Romans chapter 14. It's verses 1 through 12. Now we're abbreviating the lesson on the video today just a little bit because we're having trouble getting a full 15 minutes with our recording devices. So we're going to be a little bit quicker today. And that's fine, so just follow along as best you can. But having said that, I won't be reading all of the 12 verses out of Romans 14, 1 through 12. But let me begin. Accept anyone who is weak in faith, but don't argue about disputed matters. One person believes he may eat anything, while one who is weak eats only vegetables. And so the argument goes on, and Paul is saying that some will eat, some will not. And he even indicates that both sides think they're right, and they look down on the other side. And so as we begin this lesson, we need to understand what Paul's trying to get us to do. And the first thing is to stop judging one another. We are not to do that. He is really echoing the teaching of Jesus on the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 7, where Jesus teaches the folks that are there on the Mount to not judge one another. Paul is taking that same teaching and he's applying it to the Christian church relationship and teaching us that we are not to judge others simply because they are different than us. It may be that the context here that Paul's dealing with is that some of his readers are Gentile and some of them are Jewish. He doesn't say that right here, but that certainly makes sense because the Jews would have certain regulations for eating, Gentiles would not, and I'm sure that worked both ways. And so there could be differences in the church and folks were disparaging one another because of it, and Paul says we are not supposed to do that. What he has done here, what Paul has done for us, is drawn a distinction between what is a doctrine, something that is not to be changed, it is unchangeable, and something that is a practice which can change. Now, I'm very much aware that our practices do indeed grow right out of and are dependent upon our beliefs. But what we're trying to look at here is that some of those practices can be changed. They are interchangeable. They can be done in different ways. They can be adapted. And that's really what we're looking at in this lesson, not the ethics of living based on our faith, but rather all having the same faith, but expressing it in different ways. And that's what we're trying to see here. We are not to be engaged in disputing things that really hinder us if we're arguing over it. He says, the lesson writer says, debates only create fractures in the church's fellowship and distract it from fulfilling the commission given by Jesus. One illustration that I've experienced in years past is that the music director came to me in a church where I served and wanted to move the offering. We still had the offering, it was still collected the same way, but we put it in a different time slot. his theology was sound. Let's do the offering as a response to the proclaimed word of God and to the music and the singing. And let it be a responsive act of worship. And that sounded good to me, so we changed it. And we both got in trouble. And it wasn't that we didn't take up an offering, it's simply that we moved it from the middle of the service to the end. We had to move it back. It was unnecessary to argue over something like that, but this particular church did. And it really caused a little bit of a conflict and it distracted us from what we were supposed to be doing, which was worshiping the Lord. And so these types of things can indeed happen for us. What we notice in the New Testament when we look at Romans and also 1 Corinthians and other places is that some of these issues that Paul was dealing with happen to be in other churches as well. They were somewhat universal in the church of Paul's day. And what we find is that some of the things that we deal with in our church, they're not unique to us. The church deals with these issues all across the church. So we need to be aware of that and not feel like we're just singling things out. There were common problems. That leads me to ask, what are some things that we discuss today? What are some things we debate today? Here are a few, and the list could be rather long. What kind of music do we use? And not just music, what type of instruments do we use? Do we use video screens or not? Does the pastor put an outline up on the screen or not? The offering itself, it can be in the middle, the end, the beginning of the service. It can be in a box out in the foyer. It can be collected by a team of ushers, or it can be collected by deacons or by others. These are things that we talk about in the church's dispute from time to time, and Paul tells us we're not supposed to do this. As he continues the text, and as our writer takes this, it is really attitudes that we are looking at here. What's our attitude? We're going to be different as Christians from place to place, and even sometimes even across town we'll be different from our brothers and sisters on the other side of town. And so we want to maintain a proper attitude. It's not so much the practice, but the attitude that we engage in. And then we're reminded in verse 4 that we are servants of God, and that because we are servants of God, it changes everything. It's not about me, it's all about what He wants me to do. The lesson writer says we need to focus on being transformed into His likeness and spend less time trying to mold everyone else to be in our likeness. And that is exactly right. The second part of the text is entitled Honor God. And here we see Paul continuing to deal with real issues in the church. The first issue had to do with eating. The second one has to do with holy days. And here the text says one person judges one day to be more important than another. Someone else judges every day to be the same. And so holy days in the church in Rome were an issue. And they are somewhat of an issue for us still today. Do we meet on Sundays? Some congregations meet on Saturdays. Some work on Sundays. Some don't work on Sundays, and so on. It's not as big an issue as it once was, but it is still here. What our lesson writer encourages us to remember is that God's church is big enough to include people who differ on negotiable practices. There are some things we should never negotiate, such as Jesus is Lord. But other things we certainly can. Now I've jotted down a couple of things here, and you can add to my list. How about the frequency of the Lord's Supper? Some people say every week. Some say once a month. Some say once a quarter. Well, not every church is the same, so we need to be aware of that. How about the length of the service? I try hard to keep us at about an hour. Other churches don't even get warmed up until they've gone 2, and sometimes 3 hours. Is one right? Is one wrong? We need to understand that our purpose is to honor God. In fact, when we look at verses 7 and 8, we may be coming right down to the heart of the matter. So let me read verses 7 and 8 for you. For none of us lives for himself, and no one dies for himself. If we live for the Lord, and if we die for the Lord. Therefore, whether we live or die, we belong to the Lord. And so our lesson writer sums it up this way. Paul's logic, the foundation of Paul's logic, boiled down to one principle: ownership. Who owns us? Well, we've been bought with a price, and we are supposed to be owned by the Lord, not by ourselves. So it's His desires and wishes that we are to be engaged in, and not our own. I'm privileged to own 2 vehicles, a car and a truck. Wouldn't it be foolish for the car to say, I'm better than you because you can't carry as many people as me? And wouldn't it be foolish for the truck to say, well, I'm better than you because I can take a payload and you just have a small trunk and you can't be used for a lot of things? The argument, it would be foolish. And the truth is, they're both owned by me, and I can use either one as I deem appropriate. Folks, we are owned by the Lord, and He can use us as He deems appropriate. And so we need to understand that it can be expressed, that faith can be expressed in different ways in the church. Some things that churches deal with: the use of alcohol, the use of medical help, versions of the Bible, cell groups, multiple congregations. That's a new one. It's a new model for church. So one church, but many locations. And so we're seeing that we are to be owned by God. It's His will and not ours. The final section for this passage is to remove obstacles, and that's verses 9 through 12. And really, we sum it up in 2 things, 2 areas. Number 1, we are to treat others well because they are brothers or sisters. They're not outsiders. They're part of the family of God. And may this guide us as we deal with one another. We are different, just like in our families. We're different, but we treat each other with respect and with honor and with dignity and with decency because we are God's family. And then the last part is that each of us will give an account of himself to God. One way of looking at that is that we need to make sure that we are right with God. Not so much worrying about other people. Yes, we're to have an evangelistic imperative, and yes, we're to help teach and train, disciple. I understand that. But we're not to be critical, we're not to despise, we're not to put down. And so we need to make sure that we are right before God. And when we do that, and then recognize that the other Christians are indeed our brothers and sisters, then our relationship is better than it was, and it's like it's supposed to be. This lesson, this brief summary, helps us to understand that in the church, folks, we're going to be different. It's okay. Different churches, different denominations, different expressions of faith. We're not to change the things that are permanent, like doctrine. But after that, the practice of our faith can vary greatly. And we are to understand that we are to love God, serve Him, and honor Him. He is first, we are second. Well, God bless you as you've been listening to this, and may this little lesson have an impact on how you relate to others in the church today.